Hi, everyone. So at this juncture in the course, we're going to be talking about organizational ethics. And specifically, I want to talk about organizational ethics as it relates to policing. Up to now, there's three basic ideas that we've been kind of wrestling with as it relates to ethics. One of those ideas is the question posed by Aristotle: how should I be? Or what should I be like? And Aristotle, recall, was the thinker of virtue ethics and wanted to know which characteristics were virtuous. And then there was the golden mean, which is the middle kind of behavior between excessive and deficient. And virtue ethics, again, really answered questions about how I should be. And that's in contrast to what I think deontology and utilitarianism answered, which was really questions about what I should do. And so for police thinking about a particular situation, the question of what I should do and the ways that we might think about what I should do is really important for navigating those situations. I'd say there's a third type of question that is also really important and really relevant, and that is how I should decide. And that's very closely related to what I should do, but it's slightly different given that often our decisions are limited to a certain number of possible decisions. And there's ethical logics that we could be employing to decide what to do in specific circumstances. These three questions are often thought of as separate questions in ethics, but if you just think for a minute, kind of contemplate what those three questions are asking, I don't think it takes a genius to see that they're actually quite related. In other words, how we should be is very closely related to questions about what should we do and how should we decide. So in fact, Aristotle was very much of the view that if you want to be a virtuous person, how one should be, then you should just act like a virtuous person, which is to say that Aristotle was also concerned with what it is that we should do. We should do virtuous acts. So one might argue that it is in fact good enough that individuals learn, they take ethical courses like ours, and that they learn how to behave in a principled way, or they learn how to be virtuous. And that on an individual level, that is, that every single individual, to the extent that they learn those lessons well, or that they learn that ethical logic well, that that'll take care of how we apply ethics in the world. And what I'd like to argue right now, and for the purposes of this class, is that that is only half at best of what we should be considering. That really, ethics is not something that can simply be implemented on an individual level. Instead, we need to consider organizations. If you recall Aristotle's point about virtue ethics, remember that there isn't any single type of behavior that one should always do at all times. That for Aristotle, virtuous behavior was all about finding what was ethical for an individual. It was attentive, in other words, to context. And to give an example, if you recall one of the earlier videos that we watched, if you witnessed somebody mugging another person, what is the ethical thing to do? And if we take courage as an example, one might quickly conclude that courage is exhibited by the individual deciding to pursue the person who mugged the other person. And in fact, Aristotle wasn't so keen on that idea. It was ethical for some people, sure, to go pursue that person, but it wasn't necessarily ethical. For example, if someone was very small in stature, pursuing the criminal might not be the most virtuous act that one could do. For example, it might be reckless. What Aristotle was attentive to was context. And context is everything. If we want to think ethically, one very important context is the organization within which one is employed. So it's no secret that organizations have what are called different ethical environments, meaning that the organization, just by virtue of how it was created and the kind of qualities that the people within that organization are exposed to, or the kind of ideas that they're exposed to, the ideas that are promoted, this organizational ethical environment is something that you would want to take into consideration if you were to judge a person's ethical behavior. Say if you were the chief of a department, or if you were a policymaker who was trying to evaluate a department. On the other hand, if you're a person who is simply employed within a department and you're wanting to think about your ethics, you would also want to be attentive to the ethical environment. And the reason that you want to be attentive to that environment is because it would matter. You know, different people in different organizations have different obligations. They have different roles within that organization. And those different obligations and expectations mean that different people aren't judged in the same way. So the ethical environment is incredibly important to consider. Different organizations have different implicit understandings. Sometimes they have formal policies. All of that needs to be taken into consideration when judging the individual or determining what one should do if they want to implement changes to bring about a more ethical department or organization. Moreover, I would just add that there's a struggle here, there's a tension that I'm alluding to in my discussion of ethical environments and organizations. And that tension is really focused on a more or less universal problem that all organizations encounter, which is that as an organization develops, it often attempts to routinize procedures. There's a form for everything. The bureaucracy gets established and starts to take hold of that organization. And people complain about bureaucracies and they complain about all of the rules and procedures. But there's a really important reason why those rules and procedures are in place, and that is to prevent people from cheating, from misusing and abusing the organization so that they can secure resources for themselves. In short, rules crop up and the bureaucracy crops up in organizations because it wants to become an efficient machine to carry out its mission. And in the context of policing, that is guardianship of the community or crime fighting or any number of those missions. The tension here is that the more rules and procedures that are put in place, the less flexibility people have to react to context, okay? And so the word here that I'm kind of coming up against in policing is discretion. Discretion is, in many ways, this really important part of the job of policing, but it lies right at the epicenter of that tension between rules that ensure fairness for the community, but also the police officer, and a flexibility that's actually built into the organization that allows it to function. And so I would say that wherever this tension exists within an organization, you'll find ethical questions directly at the center of it. And so discretion and everything that term encompasses in policing is right at the center of ethics. And also at the center of ethics is context, because within situations that rely on a police officer's discretion, or when thinking about examples where police officers' discretion is important, one has to be able to evaluate context.